All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Oberhelman. I'm in the Research and Learning Services department here at the OSU Library. And I wanted to welcome you to the last Great War series talk for the spring semester of this year. I'll be introducing Dr. Chelsea Medlock in a minute. But we will be having some very interesting and exciting programs coming up next year for those of you who will be around, because this will be the period where we're actually in the centenary of the U.S. involvement in World War I. So we'll be having talks on the OAMC campus of World War I, the Chilocco Indian School up by Newkirk and World War I, the Red Cross Relief Agency. And in the spring, we'll be concluding our series with a talk on the Spanish flu epidemic, which wasn't really part of the war, but the war kind of exacerbated it. That became the world's first big pandemic of the modern era that really changed a lot of modern medicine. All right, so we'll also be having a piano concert by Dr. Perry Gethner from Foreign Languages, who's quite an accomplished pianist. And he'll be performing selections from composers, both French and German, from the World War I era. So that'll be coming up in September, early September of next year. All right. Well, today's talk is They Did Their Bit, War Animals and the Great War. And since horses will be part of it there, they did their bit, haha. Our presenter today is Dr. Chelsea Medlock. And she's a lecturer in modern European history at Oklahoma State. And she received her doctorate here in 2015. Her dissertation was entitled Remembering Forgotten Legions, the Veterinarization, that's a big word there, and British War Horses, 1870 to 1945, which examined the changing military and societal perceptions of the employment and the commemoration of British war horses in an age of total war. And the work now explores the interdisciplinary approaches to the study of human-animal interactions, memory studies, and public history. So let's please welcome Dr. Medlock. Thank you.
As he said, my name is Chelsea Medlock, and one of the things that I really want to demonstrate today with this talk or lecture is that there's a lot of different things about World War I that we don't spend a lot of time on, whether it is the history of animals or the history of food, the history of clothing. There's a lot of things about the war that we just don't have time. Whoops, sorry.
That was me.
That we don't have time in a regular class setting. And that's one of the great things that you can do. If you are truly interested in a subject, you can spend as much time as you want learning about a certain small part of your studies for the rest of your life. And that's one of the great things about college. So for today, I'm talking about war animals, specifically war horses, war dogs, war pigeons, and even things such as war glowworms. So, the first thing that I really want to ask you is, when you think of the First World War, what kind of images come to mind? Are they of the trenches, or are they of technology? I'm willing to bet that most of you, if you sat down and thought about all the movies, all the photographs that you've seen over your lifetime, most of them are probably going to be of aerial dogfights, tanks, trenches, maybe the first submarines, giant artillery guns like Big Bertha, or the Paris gun, that's the other name for it. But what I want you to consider is that while this is what we normally take away from the war, this is actually more of the everyday reality of the First World War. So, for the daily lives of most soldiers, they spent the majority of their time interacting with animals on some fundamental level. Now, there are a wide variety of different types of animals that were used, and we'll discuss a little bit about those types and what kind of occupations or employment that they had during the war. But what I want you to consider is that it's not just horses or the use of meat animals. You have things like elephants being used every day. You have camels being used. You have dogs being used in ways that had never been considered in previous wars in Europe. World War I was all about finding ways to use every single asset at your disposal to win the war, hence total war. And animals end up being one of the greatest assets for the military. So, just so that you guys can see what exactly we're looking at, I'll turn on that. Whoop. Apparently, there we go. So up in this corner, we have a photograph of horses pulling munitions, specifically on the Somme in 1916. We have the use of elephants pulling carts in the cities. This is an illustration of a mule wearing a gas mask along with his handlers. The use of pigeons, specifically this one is being used with a tank. You have camels being used in North Africa and in Eastern Europe, the Middle East. And you have dogs being used in a variety of employments that one would not normally think of in previous wars. So, to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, first I'm going to discuss some of the different species that we can find in military service during the Great War, and then I'll go into more of the logistical aspects of how were the animals procured by the military, how were they cared for, what role did the Army Veterinary Corps have in providing animals and managing animals, how animal welfare societies aided the war effort with regards to war animals, the use of animals as mascots or pets for soldiers on the battlefield. And then I'll round out the talk with a discussion of combat bonding and this idea of animals being war veterans, which is actually what my research truly entails. So, the first thing that I want to go through is to give you an idea of what type of animals could be found during, on the battlefield during World War I, and some of the different ways that they were being employed by the various belligerent nations. So the first one and the most populous war animal during the Great War is going to be, of course, horses. And one of the reasons that is because not only were horses used in logistics, such as supply transportation, laying communication wire, moving wood from the forest to the trenches to build the walls in the trenches, but they were also used for the artillery, moving the artillery guns, as well as the cavalry. And the cavalry, while we tend to think of this war as being one of the last great wars for the cavalry, it's a lot of times more characterized as being about the cavalry standing in waiting for an opening to be used, and rarely getting to see as much action as they had in the past, such as the Great great cavalry charges of the 19th century. Like horses, mules play a very important role in transportation. One of the greatest and most interesting examples is the use of mules for mountain terrain, because mules tend to be more sure-footed. They are able to climb mountainous trails a lot more easier. They tend to be a lot more hardy than horses, despite the fact that they have a little bit more of a nasty habit of having behavioral issues. There's a lot of great manuals about how to handle your mule in case it gets a little nippy with you. One of the species that people tend to really enjoy learning about is going to be the third one, war dogs. This is one of the first wars that we see a proliferation of the use of dogs on the battlefield. Previously, dogs were used occasionally, maybe for tracking, sometimes for guard duty, but it's really during World War I that you see the rise of the service dog, the rescue dog, the medical aid dog, messenger dogs. There's illustrations of dogs laying telephone wire between trenches. We also have, as I previously showed you, that dogs were used sometimes to pull machine guns from battlefield to battlefield. The Belgians especially preferred to use dogs to move their machine guns. Excuse me. Pigeons are going to be one of the next ones that are incredibly important, because what you have to remember is that while telephones and Morse code and telegrams are in use during this period, you're not able to use them with great consistency from the battlefield to headquarters. Now that could be because they were blown up, or they're just not being laid fast enough, but the Allied forces and the Central Powers a lot of times had to rely on courier pigeons and homing pigeons to deliver their messages. And there is evidence that over 100,000 courier pigeons were being used by all of the nations during this period. And there's a lot of times that nations would set up laws to protect the welfare of courier pigeons and put on hefty fines and even sometimes jail time if you were found either stealing or killing messenger pigeons. We also had camels being used to great effect in the Middle East, where you could still use horses, but sometimes they weren't as reliable in the sand and in the heat. We also have elephants, as I mentioned before, which were mainly just used for heavy lifting, beasts of burden, if you will. We also had oxen doing the exact same thing. And then we have evidence of more unusual animals that have specific jobs in the Navy or in the trenches, such as glowworms being used to light trenches at night, being used to light tunnels at night. That way the enemy couldn't see, but you could still see in the pitch black. We have evidence of mice being used almost as in a canary in a coal mine type of fashion, where they were being used to give the soldiers an idea if poison gas was coming quickly. And then, of course, we have a cadre or menagerie of different types of very exotic pets, pets and mascots that are used by soldiers throughout the war for companionship. And I have a couple of examples for you. So when it comes to procuring your war animals, a lot of the nations, of course, first started at home, and they used a variety of techniques which involved everything from voluntary seizure, voluntary surrender of animals, wherein the local populations would be asked and say, we are looking for 300 horses in the Dover area of England. If you have a horse that measures 16 hands, 5 inches, and is of a brown or bay color, please bring it to this depot and we'll examine it, and if it is selected, then we will pay you a certain amount of money to borrow your family horse or family pet, and hopefully you'll get it back. Now, of course, that last promise, not really easily kept, especially in a war that lasts 4 years. Now, when the local population starts to be tapped out, the nations then have to search abroad to see if they can find supplemental animals and animal populations for whatever they need to cover what they need that's left over. And a lot of times, especially with the Allied powers, they tended to look to their friends and colonies in North America, Australia, India, South Africa, for Britain specifically. And so we have evidence that the British specifically bought hundreds of thousands of horses and mules from both the United States and Canada to cover what they needed to fight on the Western Front and in the Middle East. Now, after about 1916 going into 1917, because of the massive casualties of the Somme and Verdun in 1916, we start seeing that animals are beginning to be conscripted and seized from local populations. If you had like 1 or 2 horses that you had kept back for a couple of years, you had a couple of 3-year-old horses that hadn't been sold yet. When conscription became necessary by 1917, even the horses were being sent into the army against the will of their owners. A lot of times it was almost like necessary danger, clear and present danger. I need your horse now, and we're probably not going to pay you for it at this time. So, and with all of this purchasing from abroad, you have to not only secure the animals for transport, but you have all the logistics of shipping them over the Atlantic at the minimum, unless you're getting horses from Australia, and then that's a whole different ballgame. But you have to figure out, how are you going to get them onto the ships? Horses don't really like to get into anything, trailers included, a lot of times. Then you have to figure out, all right, we're going to now be on a ship for numerous weeks. How do we house the horses? How do we feed the horses? How do we clean the horses? How do we make sure that they get a little bit of exercise and breathing air and breathing room? What if the horses don't like each other who are standing next to each other? How do we deal with that? And then after all of that, they finally arrive at their training destination, such as a horse depot in the south of England or northern France. You have to get them off. You have to move them to the horse depot, train them for their specific role in the military, and then once again ship them out to the front. And so it's just this very, very intense and intricate and complicated logistical nightmare, more so in many ways than than the logistics of transporting and feeding soldiers. Excuse me. So once you finally have your horses on the ground in the battlefield, you have, or dogs or any other kind of animals, you have to worry about making sure that they are running at optimal levels, just as if you were going to maintain a car or a tank. You have to have people and supplies and resources to make sure that your horses, your dogs, your oxen, everything is not dying on you after you've spent millions and millions of dollars and pounds and francs and marks on them, because these are investments just like anything else. And so one of the most important developments for the caring of animals on the battlefield was the establishment of the Army Veterinary Corps. Now, for the British, it's Royal Army Veterinary Corps, but once the Germans, the French, and the Americans, the Russians, once they all started seeing how the British was reorganizing to take care of their animals, they all kind of follow suit. So a lot of times I tend to just revert back to the British as an easy metaphor for the rest. So the way that the British specifically tended to care for their animals is that they put the remount service and the Army Veterinary Corps in charge of the procuring, the feeding, the maintaining, and the medical care of all of the animals in their possession or under their care. And so one of the first things that the Veterinary Corps had to do was establish a system for how they were going to get animals from the front to hospitals and care for them. And so what they did is they actually had a 3-step system. They tended to have mobile field units, so these would be vets that were working in the trenches or very close to the trenches. Their job was to help stabilize animals so that they could be transported further back from the lines to the regular veterinary hospitals. So they basically are doing triage, first aid in many cases. They are the first line for assessment to see whether or not an animal is going to survive the journey back to the full veterinary corps hospital. Once you get to the veterinary hospital, that is where all of the magic happens, if you want to call it that. At the time, these veterinary hospitals were state of the art, which is not something that you would normally think of on the battlefields of Europe. These hospitals not only made sure that the animals were taken care of on the very basic level, but you could do surgery at these hospitals. You could treat a wide variety of infectious diseases, lameness in many cases, and they were, of course, also in charge of euthanasia if the animal was not savable. And so here we have a picture of this right here is a picture of one of the British hospitals performing surgery on a war horse. And as you can see, it's really almost exactly what we still do today. The horses are put up on a table, they're strapped down, they're put under anesthesia if they need to, depending on how severe the wound is. And they did this all with bombs in the background many times. For me personally, I find one of the most fascinating aspects of this veterinary system to be the use of horse ambulances. Horses during World War I had specific ambulances, both horse-drawn and motorized, to carry wounded animals to and from different types of hospitals. So right here in the lower right-hand corner, I have a illustration, or a photograph of a horse-drawn ambulance. But it was not uncommon to see actual mechanized trucks being used to convey horses, which is something that you just don't consider for World War I. The third and final aspect of the veterinary hospital is something that sounds very, very British, and it's the convalescence hospital. It's more of a recovery hospital. So once the horses were treated or the dogs were treated, they were sent to a specific location where they could rest and recuperate and heal before they were then returned to the war and the battlefield. Just to give you a little idea of how important the Army Veterinary Corps and animal welfare societies' efforts were to the success of the British and the French war efforts, and later the American war efforts, I wanted to give just a very brief overview of some of the things that they were involved in and how their efforts helped change the way that animals were viewed and taken care of by soldiers. So the Army Veterinary Corps was pretty young by the time that World War I started. It wasn't officially a department or even a service within the British military until about 1881. Prior to that, it was more of a volunteer or conscription basis where you had one or two veterinarians or furriers working within units, and it was very disorganized. There was no kind of system to establish any kind of standard for the care of war animals, and specifically war horses in the 19th century. And because of this lack of structure and foundation, the British experienced one of the most catastrophic horse wastages, the killing of horses that they'd ever experienced in their history, their history of war. So during the Anglo-Boer War of 1898 to 1902, one of the issues that comes up is that the British ended up having to ship hundreds of thousands of horses and mules to South Africa. But the problem was that the horses weren't climatized to the region properly. They had no concept of infectious disease, that you shouldn't put a horse with a cough and nasal drainage with healthy horses or wounded horses. Soldiers were not encouraged to bring wounded horses back to the depots. They were just left on the side of the battlefield. A lot of times they weren't treated even for minor injuries, and a lot of times they just ended up dying because there was no proper care by the British. And so it's estimated that close to 500,000 horses died in this one war in South Africa. And only a small fraction of that was actually due to war combat. All the rest were due to illness and mismanagement. And so because of this, there was a big inquest with the British government, and they decided that, well, we don't want to do that again because we basically just wasted $20 million on horses that we didn't get to use. So immediately after the war, around 1904, 1908, the British really start restructuring how they run their veterinary services. They established the Army Veterinary Corps as its own separate identity and department, and put it in charge of every aspect of animal management for the military. The First World War is also the first time that animal welfare societies were actually allowed to be involved in a war effort. And this includes such organizations as the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, that's the RSPCA, which is the sister organization for the ASPCA. You have the Blue Cross, the Purple Cross, which are two different types of British organizations that focus more on horses specifically. And then for the Americans, they had the American Red Star, which was modeled on the American Red Cross, but for animals. And what makes the Great War so fascinating for the history of animal welfare societies is that for decades, since the 1850s, animal welfare societies had been pushing for some sort of say in how animals were treated in the military. But the British military specifically was basically like, look, you're civilians, you don't need to be involved in the military. I think you need to go back to your little corner and have some alone time with your group. We don't need you here, thanks. But the fall of 1914 changed all of that when the military saw just how horrendous this war was going to be. And by November 1914, they decided that, the RSPCA has offered to provide us with extra funds. I think we can take their money. I don't see any problem with that. Oh, they're going to offer to pay for medical supplies? Oh, that's fantastic. They're going to train our veterinarians? Wonderful. They're going to give us ambulances and supplies for our cavalry. So the British Army specifically came to realize that it was in their best interest to allow animal welfare societies to help with the management and the funding of war animals. Now, there's a little bit of a funny story with regards to the RSPCA. So The RSPCA tended to be a very territorial charity at the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century, and it specifically told the military and British society that no other charities would be allowed to help the British. And they took out large full-page ads in newspapers and in magazines, basically saying that if any other animal welfare charity asks you for money, don't give them money. Give it to the RSPCA because we're the only legitimate aid for the British military. So of course that riled a lot of feathers in the animal welfare community, specifically with the Blue Cross. And so the Blue Cross actually went to the French government and told them, well, the British are boxing us out. Do you need any help? And the French were like, heck yeah. We need all the help we can get. So the Blue Cross built their own veterinary hospitals for the French all over the Western Front, specifically mainly for horses, but sometimes for dogs a lot of times. And what their goal was, the animal societies, was to help cover any costs or buy supplies that the military either deemed luxury items or too expensive for the soldiers. So a lot of times they bought medical supplies, they bought saddle rugs, saddle cleaner, things for the soldiers, little hospitality boxes or baskets, gloves, coats, whatever they needed, these groups provided. And so as you can see right here, this is a advertisement for donations to the RSPCA, one of their many, many flyers or advertisements. And it basically, most of the time they would say something to the effect of, are you an animal lover? Do you like horses? Donate and help us save horses that are fighting alongside our soldiers. There was a lot of this back and forth tying of animals' welfare to soldiers' welfare. One of the categories that people tend to really enjoy learning about is animal mascots. So, of course, mascots are not a new phenomenon by World War I, but what makes them so interesting and unusual for the Great War is that because of imperialism and the rise of colonies throughout the world, you get a wide range of really unusual mascots being brought to the fronts from native soldiers. So, for example, let me get my clicker here. In this illustration right here, we have a baboon mascot being greeted by a child who is part of a Scottish regiment. Cats were very popular, especially on naval ships, because of course on ships you get mice, and so cats are great for mice control, but also they become pets and mascots really easily. There's examples of foxes being adopted as mascots. This one is specifically an American unit. Here we have an eagle, a kangaroo that was brought over by the Australians. We have an example of a bear being used as a mascot. Goats were very popular mascots for many regiments. Sheep. There's mention of ferrets occasionally being, I know it sounds absolutely crazy, but during this period you could actually pay someone to ship you ferrets in the post. So you would send off for your ferrets, and the mailman would arrive at the trenches with your ferrets in their bag. No, just like loose in their satchel, and then they became part of your trench life. A lot of times, the mascots were usually associated in one way or another with their either their country of origin or their regional location. And so that's why you have examples of kangaroos being brought from Australia, bears being caught, bear cubs, being found in the wild that may have been orphaned and adopted by soldiers, as in the foxes would be another example. Animals being brought from South Africa. And one of the stories that I like to mention to people is that mascots became such an integral part of the war experience that in World War II, the animal welfare societies actually worked with the government to create lists of which mascot belonged to which unit, which regiment. So you have lists and lists of almost like roll calls so that they knew exactly which animal went where, what its history was, how it got there, what happened to it, did someone take it home with them after the war. They even had a mascot club where you could get information about mascots during the war, during World War II. Excuse me. The really last and final thing that I want to cover with regards to the use of animals in combat during this period is that this war is one of the first times that we see actual evidence of soldiers actively thinking about their animals in different terms other than just being resources. So, for example, during the Anglo-Boer War, soldiers are taught, or were taught, that their horses are not theirs. They are the military's. They had numbers, so this is horse number 335. You had a rotation of horses, so you never got the same horse more than once. And so there was not a whole lot of emotional connection between soldiers and the animals that they were working with. But one of the important things that grew out of the massive carnage of the Anglo-Boer War is that the military decided that, well, we kind of screwed up there. Sorry, my bad. We actually need you to bond with your animal, because if you bond with it, you think of it as your animal, and therefore you take care of it as if it's your pet. And you will put its life before your life if worse comes to worse. And so there's manual after manual that focuses on this idea of make sure that you spend as much time with the horse that has been assigned to you as possible. Make sure that your horse has shelter just like you, it's being fed just like you. We highly recommend that you pick out a name for your horse. Don't refer to your horse as horse 330 or it. Give it a name. Call it Jack or Sandy or Pepper or Charlie or Chaplin. There was a lot of Charlie Chaplins on the list. during this period. Lots and lots of horses that were named either Charlie or Chaplin, which is extremely humorous. But they also had horses that were called Black because it was black. And the animal welfare societies really jumped on this idea and started pumping out propaganda left and right, calling war animals comrades in arms, buddies, best friends. They would produce large illustrations of horses and soldiers in compassionate poses where they're holding a horse's head, giving it a hug, stroking its neck. During the war, there's a lot of imagery of horses being wounded and soldiers staying with their wounded horses until the end. One of the greatest, most memorable examples of that is called Goodbye, Old Man. It's a beautiful painting that was commissioned by the Blue Cross, and so if you're interested, I would highly recommend you look at it later. And to go along with all of these procedural changes, we see that during the war, because horses and dogs and other animals were in such tight quarters and so close in proximity to their owners, for lack of a better word, we see that in a lot of the writings, the soldiers' memoirs, their letters home, their letters to superiors, letters to the newspapers, they're focusing and speaking about their animals in completely different ways. Some examples that I have is that one soldier wrote that the suffering of animals was something that you never forgot and could never get out of your mind. One soldier in his memoir after the war described the use of animals as being almost a sin against the animals. What he says in his letter is that soldiers, men, know why we're fighting the war. We are conscious of that. Animals have no idea why they're fighting, but yet they do it. And he said because of that type of loyalty, they deserve to be treated like veterans. They deserve better treatment than what they get. Specifically, he was specifically referencing after the war. The final aspect that really goes toward this idea of a animal veteran is that during the 20th century and the early 21st century, we see this almost exponential increase in war animals being included in war memorials. And so I have a couple of examples right here. One is the cavalry World War I memorial in Hyde Park. And you see, of course, it's supposed to be St. George standing over a dragon on his loyal steed. But we also have examples from the RSPCA. It's a little dark, so it's kind of hard to see, but this is a tableau where there is an angel in the center and you have war animals on either side celebrating victory, and it's commemorating all of the British animals that fought and died during the war. Excuse me. And of course, these are just a couple of examples. There are more recent ones that have popped up in the last decade or so in Australia, in the United States, Britain, France, Canada, Germany. just to name a few, of course. So the very last thing that I want to talk about is what happened to animals after the war ended. There's really only two options for war animals after 1918. They were either allowed to go home with the soldiers, or they were liquidated as assets. And the majority, upwards of 70-75% of the British animal stock, was sold off after the war. Most of them were usually sold to locals, and it just kind of depended. The British, being British, tended to be very meticulous in how they were selling off their horses or their war dogs. They put them in categories. They said, all right, these horses are fit enough that they can be sold to farmers to replace all of the livestock that was killed or used up by the war in France and in Belgium, in Germany occasionally. But this section over here, they're really not fit enough for that type of work, so we're going to turn them into meat animals because the French and the Belgians eat horses. So they're going to the slaughterhouse, and then the third section, they're in such poor condition that we can't sell them for anything except for byproducts. And so then they would be melted down and sold for their hides, their fats, their bones, their for gelatin, that sort of those sorts of products. The most notable event with regards to this casting system or liquidation system actually comes in Egypt and the Middle East, where almost all of the horses and animals that had been brought with the Australians onto that front were their personal pets. And they were the ones that, one of the only fronts where the animals had a very high survival rate. So an Australian farmer who brought his horse, that horse survived 3 years of fighting in the Middle East. And those soldiers were under the impression that they were going to get to take their pets home, because I brought my pet with me. I get to take it home, correct? Well, the British government said, no, we can't really do that. One, we can't afford to ship your animals back. And two, they've been exposed to a whole bunch of diseases in the Middle East, so they need to stay put. You have no say over this. That animal is going to be sold off to local populations, and there are not going to be any Australian horses shipped back home with you. Now, of course, there was one horse that did get to go home, but she technically was a general's horse, and it was shipped back in 1915 because it was going to be at the head of his funeral. And so when it died, they stuffed its head, and it's in the museum now. So Sandy is the only horse that actually made it back to Australia, which is why I put her name up here. So, of course, the Australians were very, very upset about this, and there were numerous incidents where, against military orders, they actually took their horses out into the middle of the desert and shot them all en masse. And so there's images and film and memoirs where soldiers said, I hated to do it, but I couldn't let my horse be sold off to those terrible Egyptians or natives, because of course racism. It's definitely not new. And so in one event, like 20,000 horses were shot on a series of days just because they didn't want them to be sold off. But the majority of horses and dogs ended up being sold off with no fuss or minor complaints. Dogs, more often than not, were the ones that would get to come home. The RSPCA, the Blue Cross, a lot of other organizations set up procedures, quarantine procedures, and ways for soldiers to bring their dogs home with them from the front. And so there's a wealth of material, archival material out there that deals with soldiers returning home with their war dogs, which is still an issue today. I mean, we still have issues with people being able to bring, or soldiers being able to bring their dogs back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Something fun that I thought I would just throw in here was a few really short stories about famous animal veterans or famous animals that came out of the war. So, and I put some of their pictures up here. So this painting is of Warrior, who is probably going to be the most famous horse to survive World War I. He was credited with saving 70 or more soldiers because he not only warned them that there was an impending attack or gas attack coming, but he was also lauded routinely for his bravery under fire and being able to whip up the morale of the soldiers under his owner's command because he was so loyal to his owner and so enthusiastic to charge into battle. We also have Charmy, which is the most famous pigeon of World War I. It is credited with saving the Lost Battalion in 1918 because it flew with a message of where the Lost Battalion was, and it had been shot twice, and it had a broken leg, and so of course they stuffed it as a memorial to it and its successes. Down here is the head of Sandy, the Australian horse, to make it back, and it is currently in the Australian War Memorial Museum. And then, of course, this adorable little dog is probably the most famous American war animal to come out of the war. This is Sergeant Stubby, and he was the most decorated dog of the war. He was a stray. They just happened to kind of wander into the American trenches. They adopted him as a mascot, and he is normally credited with saving his units and his regiments' lives numerous times over from attacks and gases and a wide variety of things, some of which are not, of course, are probably a little mythical. But as you can see, I mean, he's just utterly covered in medals, all up and down. And there's even some on the other side. The last one that I was going to mention, and he's not as famous
now as he was, of course, but Rin Tin Tin has his origins in World War I. He was also a stray, a small little German Shepherd puppy that happened to be picked up by an American who actually brought him home and trained him, and so he became this famous Hollywood actor and gave birth to a whole bunch of other little Rin Tin Tins that carried on his legacy, just like Lassie. So, in conclusion, not only were war animals incredibly important for logistics in fighting the war in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, but they also had a very important role in the way that we as a society think about the use of animals in war and the use and treatment of animals on a daily basis. It's one of those things that because the war was so highly publicized and there was pictures everywhere, it made people start to really think about how are we using horses and dogs in society, in the military. Do they need better treatment? Do they need better medicine? Should we remember war animals on the same level as we remember the actions of soldiers, of human soldiers? And so you get a diversification of the way that we view the use of animals and our relationship with them throughout history. We get the use of animals, of war animals in art. This example right here of a horse skull is actually made entirely of spent munitions from Iraq. The artist had melted down gun casings to create this piece of artwork. We have the rise of animal war memorials. This one specifically is the Animals in War Memorial in London, and it's actually only half of it. I'd need 3 more pictures to show you the rest of it, but it's probably one of the most elaborate animal memorials in the world. We also have the use of poppies as symbols for animals in war. World War I really spawned the use of red poppies to commemorate soldiers who have given their lives and their memory. And it's now being used as purple poppies for animal victims of war, specifically, of course, in Britain. And then finally, despite all of our technology, and all the computers and drones that we're using to fight wars, we occasionally still have to rely on animals to help us fight our battles. And specifically, in this example right here, we have this example illustrates the use of horses in Afghanistan by the United States. And then, of course, on any given day, you can go on to Facebook and see memorials to combat animals being shared hundreds of thousands of times over. So if there's one thing that I would like you to take away from this talk, is that while history in the past may have been about the mainstream and great leaders and great dates, what we need to focus on are the mundane aspects of our lives, because they're just as important. as any great figure. Thank you.